talking about stats is something that gets some people riled up and some people absolutely love it, right?
Right.
Um, when it comes to stats, what are you really looking for? Like, is it some of the advanced analytics that are more important to you? Is it fantasy production in previous years that's more important to you? Like, when you look overall and you're first starting to dive into your analytics for fantasy football, 'cause that can mean a lot of shit.
Right.
Analytics can mean a lot to a lot of
Right.
people. Where do you start to go first? Like, what's the most important thing for you to start looking at when you're analyzing metrics or numbers?
I think usually it starts with a question. So you kind of will have a question about a player like, oh, it's what did this player get much red zone usage, or did they actually get volume, and did they get high value touches, that kind of thing. I think that's a decent starting point to kind of just get an idea for what their role was in the past and what it might be going forward. There are certain things that you could test and see that they're not too predictive or not too consistent year over year. So it's like something like yards per carry that changes a lot year to year.
Right, right.
So there's obviously stats that are better than others. Um, but yeah, it's really just about being curious and kind of thinking about what might matter, and then going back and trying to see if what your initial thought, see if that was correct, and kind of trying to approach it more scientifically. um but yeah.
When I think about this, man, and it's tough because
Hmm.
as somebody who's like, I'm pretty strong in math. Math was like one of my stronger suits in school. I took like
Right.
got away up to Calc 3 and taking AP stats, things like that, right?
Hmm.
When I understand the value of the number and I understand the value of certain metrics and statistics, but in fantasy, for so long, advanced metrics were not part of the game. We didn't have these
Right.
numbers. And you see it all over everybody's analysis now. I'm starting to get to a point where I'm questioning how relevant are these advanced analytics, right? And I want to get your expert opinion on this as somebody who is deeper into the analytics side than I am. How do you value the advanced analytics more so than like just production on the field? For somebody like myself who's like, oh, I watched the game, or oh, I don't need numbers, and
Right.
probably a lot of error on that analytically. How do you value these advanced analytics?
I would say it depends on your definition of advanced. If you're looking at just like pure touches, I don't think that's anything too, advanced. Or if you're looking at like red zone touches, even that I feel like is not too out there.
Let me
I
give
think
you let me
that's
give you some examples. So like A dot, yards per route
okay.
run, expected
So
fantasy points, things like that.
yeah, so I think your base should always be production and what they've done in the past, because that is like by far kind of the most predictive thing. Um, but then there's obviously things that are baked into that production that are less predictable. Like I said, yards per carry is less predictable. And so you might want to look at something more like, expected fantasy points, which is essentially just a weighted volume. Um, and so
What do
you
you mean
might
by
want to
weighted
look.
volume?
Okay, so it's slightly complex, but essentially you're just taking every situation, every touch a player is in, and you look historically, you're like, okay, how much fantasy points would this have been worth on average in this exact situation? And so you look at like down and distance, you look at, maybe the score differential, stuff like that. Um, all the things that we have available to us that would
Right.
make sense to account for. Um, and so it essentially just creates an expected value for, okay, like say it's 3rd and 10 and you get a carry that goes for, whatever. It's creating expected like fantasy points based off of history in those same situations. And so yeah, obviously, and then when you're closer to the red zone too, this is probably the more important thing. The closer you are to the red zone, the higher your expected fantasy points will get, right?
Right.
Because touchdowns are 6, right? So it's like um that's that's really the gist of expected fantasy points. But like I said before, you do want to start off with, past production, and then kind of test and see like, okay, 'cause, like, I said, you do wanna start off with, past production, and then kind of test and see like, okay, 'cause, like, I said, you do wanna start off with, past production, and then kind of test and see like, okay, 'cause, like, I said, you do wanna start off with, past production, and then kind of test and see like, okay, is their expected fantasy points or volume, does that match up with their past production? Or is there a discrepancy? If, maybe they were really good in expected fantasy points, but their production was terrible, right? Like someone like Deontay
Deontay
Johnson.
Johnson. Yep,
Yeah.
Deontay
Yeah.
Johnson.
But I think there's very, very clear evidence that this player is good, right? If you go to the receiver tracking metrics on, 538, they're made by ESPN. He has a 99 open score. If you look at Matt Harmon's reception perception, it's green throughout the whole chart.
Right.
Like the guy can play football. The only thing is the situation is a little murky, right? But situation is something that can change pretty rapidly.
I agree.
So,
but I guess that's the part that I start to deal with, right? Like on a personal basis, or when I look at, I'm like, I understand open rate. I understand being good at football, but does it equate to fantasy points? I think for me, you talk about previous history, a lot of that is baked in. Like, are they an elite receiver? Do they have elite metrics? But then also, can they produce fantasy points? Because there's some guys who don't get open. Right? We talk about win rate, open rate, whatever. There's some guys who don't get open and they still are very good at fantasy. And there's some guys who all they do is get open and they're not very good at fantasy. And I struggle with that because as somebody who goes through and I look, like I get the part of being an analyst and I get how much data-driven results can be an indicator for future success. They're not an absolute. And the part that I struggle with, this ain't a you. Like this is just the part I struggle with is I think everybody in Dynasty, we got in our Dynasty hats. We got in our analyst hats. Everybody wants to be an analyst and be able to track production and who's good and who's not. And I think we kind of lose some of the fact that like, yo, these guys got to just got to score fantasy points at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah, I think there definitely is value in what you're saying. Like the past production is the most predictive. I think where the disconnect is where you see like, okay, this player is good in this metric, but how come they're not scoring fantasy points? And they like continually are not scoring fantasy points. I think a lot of it will just be situational factors, or maybe there's a part about their game that's not being captured by the numbers that is causing them to not have success. Like I would say DeAndre Swift is one where analytics community really, really loved him because his missed tackles forced would be off the charts and like all his evasion metrics and whatnot. And they would be very, very good. And then he would finish at like RB 15 or something. So it's kind of like, and I think a big part of it we saw last year, he just didn't get used on the red zone, right? He didn't get Jamal Williams got basically all the goal line carries. So there's something about his game where the coaches just didn't trust him at the goal line, right? And so that wouldn't be captured by something like, missed tackles forced. And
like just kind of thinking about this right now, and it's like I think the biggest part of this is like smaller players for a lot of most of the time are quicker, they're shiftier.
Right.
And that doesn't always equate on the football field. I think maybe that's, this is some self-realization right here live on the show. I'm thinking about it like when I was thinking about like the Twitter community, right? You can tell guys who are active on Twitter and know the stats in and out. They'll have guys, Tony Pollard, Ramondre Stevenson, Deontay Johnson, Hollywood Brown. Like it's a lot of the same consistent names. Gabe Davis last year, right? I would say there's a lot of people on Gabe Davis last year.
I mean, the reception, well, yeah, but I don't think analytics would have told you to pick Gabe Davis. Like, I think there wasn't really an analytics. Twitter, yeah, but that was really more so like just kind of hype, I guess, around the Bills offense and like, oh, who else will receive the ball kind of thing.
All right, I'll give you, maybe we'll save Gabe Davis then. But guys like, he actually would have been a counter to what I'm trying to say anyway. I think sometimes the smaller guys have the quick shiftiness. They're going to be able to get open. But if a guy maybe can't create the same separation and they're 6'3", 215, they don't need the same separation. Like a Mike Evans doesn't need the same separation as a Deontay Johnson. So you're going to look like a much better receiver, numbers-wise, win rate rise. Like you're going to look like that. But then at the same time, if I have the size to make up for it, I don't need 5 yards of separation. I don't need 2 yards of separation.
Right.
So I think there might be a little disconnect there with some of the win rate and open rate metrics as opposed to like contested catch and like being able to make up for it. Like George Pickens, a lot of people are off George Pickens because he doesn't get open. I'm like, shit, he catches the rock if he's covered or not.
Yeah. Okay. So the thing about the ESPN receiver tracking metrics, they like went through and they did a really thorough job, and they kind of found that, you know, the catch score, which would be like your ability to get contested catches, I think would be a good way to think about that. But catch score and then also YAC score, both those things are not very predictable year over year, but open score is by a big amount, right? Open score is predictive, like year over year. You can kind of roughly expect the same guys high in open score to be high again in the next year, but the same can't be said for catch score and YAC score. And right, that's not saying that catch score and YAC score like don't influence fantasy production, because they definitely do. You could literally look and see, you know, someone like Chris Godwin, he's never really had the highest open score, but you know, he's in the seasons where he was good, he had a high YAC score or a high catch score or both, right? And so that's kind of more of a hard thing to predict. Like obviously you have specialists like Pickens, I think is probably, you know, one of those guys where his catch score will probably be pretty high year over year. Debo is probably going to have a high YAC score year over year, right? So will like Jamar Chase. But it's kind of like just not as reliable. Like more things could influence those things. Like situation can make YAC and catch score, you know, completely like get messed up.
But
right?
sometimes
like,
it's just the fact that they dogs, bro. Like sometimes when I look at YAC or I look at like sometimes the receiver is just a dog, bro. And so I don't know. It's there's a little bit of conflict when trusting or blindly trusting analytics, in my opinion, because they only tell part of the story. They tell part of the story unless you use them in the right way. So, you know, stuff like one thing though you mentioned like previous score. Is there a stat that you use that you feel like the fantasy community, as somebody who's in data and analyst, is there a stat that you use that you feel like is underserved in the fantasy community that we need to be paying more attention to?
For any particular position or
any
just
particular
overall?
position? Yeah, just is there something that like maybe we as a fantasy community, I know to look for fantasy points. I know to look on a points per game basis. I know, you know, some of the advanced metrics, but is there one that you're like, this actually has a lot more impact than people think?
Okay. So I think my go-to would probably be, and this is generally like the best thing I think for in-season management and way. And there's kind of a running back version of this too, but it's weighted opportunity rating for receivers and tight ends. It's essentially just a blend of target share and air yard share. And so it basically tells you, okay, which players are getting the most targets, and then also which players are getting targeted, you know, deeper down the field or more part of their team's air yards. The more air yards a player is getting, the more a team is basically telling you, like, we want to get that player the ball, right? And so that rolls the two up into one stat, and that is shown to be pretty predictive. And that was originated by Josh Hermsmeyer of 538. And so that's a really good one. And if you're trying to use it for like waivers and whatnot, you want to look at like a 3 to 4 game rolling average of that stat. And you can find that at airyards.com. That's Josh Hermsmeyer's site. And then you could also there's various sources online where you could find that. But that to me, I think has served me the best, especially when their production hasn't been very good, and they like haven't scored touchdowns as of late.
Right.
If you use that, they're generally continuing to get opportunity. And so that's a good way to find guys that are like, okay, that are buy lows also. So
good point there.
And
Sometimes with air yards, bro, I don't always believe the air yards, right? I don't. I'm just gonna be real. Like, I don't always
yeah,
believe the air yards, but I think that that's a really good point, though, because if you're gonna use these numbers and use them to your advantage, if the team is looking to get somebody the ball and you can actually see that and equate it out to yardage, air yardage,
right.
like, yeah, I think that that's a solid way to find somebody maybe that's floating on free agency or maybe somebody that's undervalued and you're looking at trade options.
Mhm.
It's a good number. It's a good way to find a little bit of extra value and validate that thought process that you might have in your head.
Right. And I think that's kind of a more, um, I guess, tame version of expected fantasy points. Where expected fantasy points, it's heavily weighting red zone opportunities. And so that can change a lot week to week depending on, the game, the over under and stuff like that. And so when you use weighted opportunity rating, you're basically saying like, oh, well, I don't necessarily think that I can know when this player will get a lot of red zone opportunity because, predicting individual games is a little bit difficult. Like if
Right.
you try to predict shootout, like which games will be shootouts, you'll have an okay success rate,
You
but like
can. There's
not,
a reason why
yeah,
you gamble on those numbers, the over under.
right.
There's a reason why people lose a lot of money because you try to predict this shit. It's tough. It's football.
Exactly. So that's kind of the benefit of weighted opportunity rating is it's basically the same thing as expected fantasy points, except it doesn't have that red zone factor that can oftentimes it gives you more information, but it can add some noise to the signal. And then for running back, um, quality stats, I believe his name is on Twitter. He developed his own version of weighted opportunity rating, but he does it for running backs. Um, and that one is you could basically just use expected fantasy points. They're very similar. He just essentially weights like touches that are within the 5 yard line, like super high and stuff like that. It's not, you know, and he combines the rushing opportunity rating or whatever with weighted opportunity rating,
Huh.
and so he smushes them together because obviously running backs they also receive the ball. So yeah, you get an idea for how much work a running back might be getting.
So, and I know you're around. Like, obviously, you're tapped in with the analytics.
Hmm.
Which one's bullshit, bro? Which no? When do you see
Oh, okay,
somebody post and you're like,
that's
"What's
easy.
one? This is bull. This is complete bull. Like these numbers
Yeah.
don't mean anything." Is there a specific stat
Mhm.
that you see that floats around that you're just like, "Bro, what are you doing?"
Yeah, so rush yards over expected is something that I see like cited a lot. And I think the idea and concept behind it is good. Like the thought process behind it makes sense, right? You're trying to see, okay, historically, how many yards are they expected to get in every situation? Kind of like expected fantasy points in that matter. But essentially, it's kind of just telling you because running back is replaceable. This is going to be a little bit much, but because running back is replaceable, it's going to basically tell you that, Nick Chubb is this amount above expectation on a per carry basis. And the number will be like a decimal, right? It'll basically say, oh, his yards per carry is expected to be this, and this is his actual yards per carry. And it'll show you the difference of that, and that's the rush yards over expected. But the issue with that is when you pace it out, it'll come out to like he's only getting like 10 yards more per game on the ground than the average running
Oh,
back in the same situation. So it's like, is that as a fantasy, player, is that useful? Not
yeah,
really.
it's not
Like
really
that's
a point of game.
literally, yeah, 1 point. Um, and so yeah, maybe it has some utility in like, okay, like who are the like good running backs? But even then, I question it too because you'll see some running backs that are high in PFF grade and bad in rush yards over expected, or you'll
Yeah,
see that they're really good at forcing missed tackles, but they're lower in rush yards over expected. Like David Montgomery is an example of that. Um, I did find during some of my offseason research, and this is like a super advanced stat um,
okay,
for running
drop it.
backs. So essentially, when a running back is facing like a stacked box where it's 7 or more defenders in the box, um, their missed tackles forced in that situation is more predictive than just overall or anything.
More
So that's
predictive of what?
more predictive of fantasy points and more predictive, I guess, of skill, right?
The Mike
Um,
Davis number.
yeah, I actually haven't looked at how he fared in that because there's a good chance that he was facing a lot of stacked boxes because the offense was so like one dimensional that year, and so yeah, I wonder about that. But yeah, that's a thing that, and also you don't want to look at it on a per attempt basis. That's gonna throw everything off. You want to roll it up with volume.
Okay.
So just look at the total overall, and it'll give you a list of all the top missed tackle force leaders. And yeah, and that's what you should kind of more so go with. Um, some people have told me, oh, well, you're just capturing volume. Well, not really, because if you look at the leaderboard of missed tackles force guys versus the leaderboard of total attempts, there is some differences there, right? And so it is capturing some of the skill of a running back. How much does this affect how you value certain players? I couldn't even
Yeah,
tell you,
probably
to
have to
be
be like
honest.
on bad teams, right? Like, is this
Right.
guy good? Or was he good? Was he bad? Or was he just
Yeah.
stacked up
So
against the box a lot?
Najee is someone that I know you like a lot,
Yes, sir.
and he was somebody that I was off on a little bit. But then if you look at it more contextually and you see, oh, he was hurt the first like half of the season, and you can clearly see a difference between the first half and second half, where he got better in the second half. And then you look at the stat that I mentioned, missed tackles forced against, heavier boxes, and he was third, only behind Nick Chubb and Derrick Henry.
Oh
So
wow.
he can play, and that was over the full season. That wasn't like taking the second half. That was a full season. And yeah, he did get a lot of attempts, but like I think there is real signal in that, and he is a good player, and people are just fading him right now, and it doesn't
Najee
make much
love. I
sense.
love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Send the Najee love this way, bro. All right. Drafts are about to start. You're the
Mhm.
man when it comes to the numbers. Give the people one thing as you're heading into your drafts this year, one thing that they should be doing differently, maybe than what they normally do. Give them something, a
Okay.
word of advice from Connor LaPlante.
I
Drop
feel
some
like
knowledge on them.
I feel like you're kind of just like, tossing me up an alley oop, because yeah, I think what I'm gonna say too. Um,
I don't actually.
oh, okay. I thought you were like leading into me like, oh, go zero RB.
I was not leading into that, but let me hear
Okay.
it. Let me hear it though.
um, but I wasn't necessarily going to say that. I think more so what's more important is aiming for upside. I think that's obvious. Like everybody knows. Like, okay, well, you want to try to get the best players. Like that sounds stupid. People look at you funny if you say that. They're like, of course I know to do that. But then you'd be surprised how many people draft guys that don't really have like top tier upside.
Yeah.
Um, and so they're worried about like in the mid to late rounds taking players that have high floors. It just doesn't make any sense because they're just not going to help you that much. The top tier guys in fantasy are such difference makers that like you should probably devote all your energy to getting those guys, right? And so yeah, the hit rates as you go through the draft are going to be lower on getting some league winning guys, but even just thinking about like, okay, like could this guy have 2 or 3 like 20-point plus weeks in the season? Like, does he have a path for that?
Yep.
And so just thinking about that, and then um, you could get guys that are league winners in stretches, not necessarily the full season. But those can be super valuable and super crucial to your success. And so yeah, focusing on upside and trying to think about a player's path and how they could be successful. Um, and also like if they're in a bad offense, I think this is an interesting way of looking at it. If they're in a bad offense or projected to be a bad offense, and that's what's pushing their ADP down, Christian Watson, um, then you really should probably target them because that's probably their floor.
You make some good points, man, because I think that I use that a lot, but I don't say it so eloquently as you just did, right? Like when I think of players like Isaiah Pacheco, like to me, there's
Right.
not a whole lot of ceiling with him. He seems like a mid-tier guy for the entire portion of the season. So I
Mhm.
tend to rate him a little bit lower than I would say he's getting drafted the same spot as Javonte Williams. I'm like, Javonte Williams, yeah, he's coming off the ACL, but there's a path to him being like a top 15, 12 back
Yeah, I
if
agree.
everything aligns right.
Mhm.
So when I look at when I look at talent, I look at players, I'm like, all right, if I get that they perform well. Like a Hollywood Brown to me is not a top 12 guy. I don't see top 12 in his realm of possibilities at any given point in time. So I'm gonna look at a guy that does have a little bit more upside. And I know I'm probably
Yeah.
name dropping some names. Maybe I'm, getting black, but
Yeah.
that is how I view it as well. I look for upside
Mhm.
in those drafts. So you hit on a really good point there, my man.
Yeah, thank you. I
Yes,
I
sir.
I wanted to say, I don't know if you were trying to wrap it up or
No, go
whatnot,
ahead.
but, Marquise Brown, he's in an offense where we're projecting it to be pretty bad, which I think is
Terrible.
kinda fair, right? Because we don't know when Kyler is gonna play, if he's even gonna play this season. Um, damn, I lost my train of thought. But,
Yeah, it's good. Hollywood, bro. It's I don't know. I'm just not a big Hollywood Brown guy. Okay.
yeah, so okay, I got it back. So, essentially, you also can think about, and you're a big guy on this, trying to target guys for the playoffs. So maybe around playoff time, Kyler's back and Marquise Brown is the clear number one target. To me, like he could string together 2 to 3 games at the end of the season there, and that would really, really help your your playoff contention. Um,
Maybe.
right. So
Maybe.
so that's another thing to think about is like not only just the upside that a player has during the season, but then their upside that they could have over the last 3 weeks where your playoffs are.
That's a good call. Good call on that, man. Let people know where to find you at, Connor. Where are they finding your stuff at,
Okay.
bro?
So on Twitter, I'm cplant_. On TikTok, I believe it's also cplant_. It's just the letter C and then plant. And then on YouTube, I'm trying to get that going a little bit. That's cplant, just with nothing, no underscore or anything. And then, yeah, and then on DLF, you can find, I wrote like one article there so far. So
Good.
you can go check that out. You just have to type in my name, Connor LaPlante, but yeah, that's where you can find me. And yeah.
Well, Connor, always sharing really good information, man. Even if we don't always agree on everything, I do learn a lot from you and what you post and what you talk about, man. So you guys make sure to drop him a follow. Check out his YouTube page. Very good member of the fantasy community right here that you guys have on the show with you. So I appreciate you guys checking me out. Make sure you guys hit the like button, hit the share button, hit the subscribe button on all social media platforms. Drop the follow. We'll see you next time. Peace.